Thomas and Jesslyn will be talking a little bit about their stories and sort of how they got here, and then we will have a Q&A session. So save your questions for the end, but it's a long session, so we really hope to open up the dialogue and want to hear from you as well. Thomas Drake is a hero. He is a man who stood up to the NSA and whistle blew on issues that are very, very important. He used to be a senior executive with the National Security Agency, where he witnessed massive waste, contract fraud, and government wrongdoing, as well as widespread violations of the Fourth Amendment rights of U.S. citizens. While at the NSA, he became a material witness and whistleblower for two 9/11 congressional investigations with the Department of Defense Inspector General audit. Oh, sorry, I'm terrible at reading these things. I'm going to let Thomas talk a little bit about who he is. I also am delighted to say that Jesslyn Radack is here. She's an attorney and she works with the Government Accountability Project. She just mentioned to me that we can mention that she will be representing Edward Snowden going forward. And actually, with that, I'm going to let you guys tell your story. So Jesslyn is coming up first, I believe. So you guys are in for a treat. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Now, I am mic'd up, so you should be able to hear me okay. But if you don't, let me know now before I talk and no one's hearing. Everyone okay? Yes.
I have a feeling that as you talk, your voice is going to go down, so if you could amplify yourself, I think it'd be great. Louder would be better.
Okay, I can do that. I can definitely do that. I am Jesslyn Radack. I work for the Government Accountability Project, which is the nation's leading whistleblower organization. And I have a very circuitous path to the job that I'm now in because I myself had been a whistleblower back during the George W. Bush administration. I was a Justice Department ethics advisor. And I happened to be the attorney on call the day that I got a phone call from a criminal division attorney who said the FBI was on the ground in Afghanistan and had caught the first detainee in the war in Afghanistan, a fellow named John Walker Lind, who was quickly dubbed the American Taliban. And he told me matter-of-factly that Lind had counsel and wanted to know about the ethical propriety of interrogating him. So I advised what I always would advise in this situation, that if someone has a lawyer, you can't interrogate them without their counsel. It's a pretty basic legal concept, but department attorneys somehow needed to be reminded of this. So I gave that advice on a Friday, and I got a call back on Monday saying, oops, the FBI interrogated him anyway. No worries, this happens before when the criminal division or any other part of DOJ ignores ethics advice and does its own thing. Not to worry, just seal off the interrogation and use it for national security, use it for intelligence gathering, but not for criminal prosecution. So what did the Justice Department do? They used it to prosecute him criminally. So the Attorney General, who loved his flashy press conferences, went on TV to announce the indictment of the American Taliban, John Walker Lind. Meanwhile, pictures, trophy photos of him were circulating around the world. A famous picture of him bound, gagged, tied up, bound to a board with epithets written all over him. It looked very reminiscent of the photos we would later see in 2004 at Abu Ghraib. It was our first glimpse of torture, but it was right after 9/11, and no one flinched. Anyway, the Attorney General had one of his big press conferences to announce that charges were being filed, criminal charges, against John Walker Lind. And a reporter said, it looks like he's being tortured. What's going on here? And the Attorney General said that John Walker Lind's rights had been carefully scrupulously guarded, which was obviously false. I am gagged from talking in depth about the torture part, but then, I mean, that was clear that was going on also, in addition to denying him counsel. A few weeks later, actually 10 days later, he had another press conference. This time, we're indicting John Walker Lindh. And a reporter, again, said, I thought he had a lawyer. Has he had access to his lawyer? And Attorney General Ashcroft said, if we are aware that he has an attorney, he would definitely have access to that attorney. Again, another blatant lie. But like another whistleblower, Snowden, I was 29 years old and a bit naive and idealistic and thought, you know what, he's the Attorney General. It's his prerogative to say whatever he wants. The criminal case continued to proceed. And then one day, I got an email from the prosecutor saying, as you know, there is a federal court discovery order for all Justice Department correspondence related to John Walker Lindh's interrogation. I have 2 of your emails. I wanted to make sure I have everything. I knew I had written way more than 2 emails about this. It was a file about an inch thick back in the days where we kept hard copy paper files on everything. But luckily, I also had email at DOJ. And you know, I said, you know what, I know I wrote a ton of emails on this. I'm just gonna check the file. So I run up and check the hard copy file, and it's basically empty. There are 2 like very like a fax cover sheet and then a piece of paper saying thank you, and some other thing saying we're closing out the file. So I was like, where did everything go? So I consulted with a very senior attorney who had been a US attorney for 7 years, and I'm like, what's going on here? And he was familiar with the case, and he just said very matter-of-factly, this file has been purged. And that was inconceivable to me, because the Justice Department was simultaneously prosecuting Arthur Anderson and Enron for obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence. So the idea that the DOJ would get rid of relevant evidence was completely counter to everything I believed. And I mean, and that's when I felt like, something that was my aha moment or my moment of truth that something really wrong was going on. So I called technical support. Here's the water. And I said, is there any way to recover some of the emails I wrote? I wrote a lot of emails in this case. And luckily, the genius at technical support was able to walk me through a number of ballet steps to recover the emails that had been missing. That was something never contemplated, I guess, by whoever purged the file. I wrote a memo to my boss, and I documented more than a dozen emails, pretty incriminating ones that basically said the FBI screwed up and interrogated an American, John Walker Lindh, without his counsel. I gave it to my boss, and I said, you know, I'm not going to be a part of this. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm giving you my 2 weeks notice. I'm resigning because after 9/11, everything was changing at the department, and I didn't want to be wrapped up in what seemed to me like a huge cover-up. So I resigned. I went to work for a private law firm doing unrelated stuff. And the criminal case continued to proceed. And John Walker Lindh, like him, don't like him, it doesn't matter. I mean, the point is he's an American, and he was denied counsel, and the entire prosecution turned on the validity of the confession he gave during his interrogation without a lawyer. And there was a suppression hearing coming up to decide whether or not that confession would be admissible at trial. And over again, I kept hearing in the media, well, he never had a lawyer, so of course the confession is admissible. At that point, he was facing a couple of life, death penalty counts. And again, whether you think he's a terrorist or guilty or innocent or whatever, I couldn't live with the idea that someone might be put to death because my emails had obviously not made it to the court in compliance with the order. I went to the judge. The judge told me I no longer had standing because I had left the Department of Justice, so I couldn't just directly give them to the judge. I tried. And when that didn't work, I was a raging insomniac and just many sleepless nights. And one morning I heard Mike Isikoff, who is with MSNBC now, he was on NPR saying, well, John Walker Lind never had an attorney, therefore everything he said is fair game in the trial. And there was sort of this national hysteria after 9/11, understandably to a certain degree, that permeated this whole thing. I mean, not only did we capture the first terrorist, but he was an American. I mean, really, he was a lost 16-year-old who had gone over and been caught in this bad situation, fighting somehow as a foot soldier with the Taliban, who up until 4 months earlier, US supported and gave money to. I guess he didn't get the memo that, we had changed sides now after 9/11. So I called up Mike Isikoff and I'm like, look, I don't know who's giving you these talking points, but they're wrong. It's just plain wrong. He had an attorney, a pretty well-known attorney, very high-profile attorney. And Isikoff was like, do you have any proof? And I sent him the emails. And he wrote an article called The Missing Lind Case Emails. And after that, the case settled very promptly in a surprise plea bargain because the prosecution basically knew it couldn't go forward. It was going to lose in the suppression hearing. And it had committed ethical misconduct. So he pled guilty to 2 minor administrative counts, but he's serving like a very stiff 20-year sentence. But I thought, okay, thank God that whole episode is over with. But I didn't realize that in contacting a Newsweek reporter, in contacting Mike Isikoff, I had unleashed the full force of the entire executive branch. Agents came to my law firm and told them I was a criminal and that I would steal criminal files. It took a while to figure out, for them to actually admit that I was under investigation. I ended up retaining a lawyer. He kept telling them over and over again that I blew the whistle on prosecutorial misconduct, not complying with the federal court order to turn over relevant documents in one of the most high-profile cases going on at that time. But the Justice Department did not care. They cared a lot more about going after me. They put me under one of the first federal criminal leak investigations in the US. Leaking, there's no such crime as leaking. There's just not. There's no crime called leaking. We do have something called the First Amendment that allows you to go to the media. But again, this is right after 9/11, and I didn't realize that our Constitution was now regarded as quaint and obsolete, in the words of the next Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales. So they told the law firm I was under a criminal investigation. The law firm put me on an indefinite, unpaid leave of absence. I applied for unemployment insurance and got my big, like $100 a week or whatever to buy groceries and gasoline. The Justice Department helped my private law firm contest my receipt of unemployment benefits, which is weird. Since when does the government help a third party retaliate against an employee? But they did. but I won that one. The criminal case closed after a year and a half with no charges being brought. And again, I thought, good, this whole episode is behind me. I don't have to deal with this anymore. But no, the government was not through. Within weeks, they referred me to the state bars in which I'm licensed as an attorney. That really puts a damper on being able to get hired anywhere, because if you're under bar investigation, I don't know how many people here are maybe attorneys. Anyone? How many people here are NSA? Sometimes people raise their hands, isn't it? It's funny. You're not supposed to do that. You're violating your secrecy agreement. So I was under bar investigation. No one wants to hire you because just the fact that you're being investigated, even though you haven't been found to have committed a crime, is going to raise the malpractice liability insurance for wherever you want to work. And then, in addition to that, I started having trouble flying with my family. I was pregnant with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, well, at that point, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and found out that I had been put on the selectee portion of the no-fly list, which means you have to undergo secondary screening every time you want to fly, which may not seem like a big deal, but when your family gets through security and you're held up for half an hour and it's a matter of them getting on the flight without you, that happened a number of times. Also, it was just obviously a lot of security theater that was meant to intimidate and harass. Obviously, I was not really a threat to aviation safety, which would have been a legitimate reason to put someone on the selectee portion of the no-fly list. So I was on that until about 2009. But as horrible as all that was, at least I never got indicted. So when I did go back to work, I decided I was going to dedicate my life to representing whistleblowers because it was such a horrible ordeal. And it actually didn't fully end until this past summer. The DC bar finally dismissed its complaint against me 10 years after it was filed, more than 10 years. So I decided to go and represent whistleblowers and ended up at the Government Accountability Project. And I thought, okay, I'm going to be doing employment law, dealing with whistleblowers who have been demoted or had their security clearances pulled, or maybe even at worst got fired. So my life was really jarred. I knew we had crossed a Rubicon when I read that a man named Thomas Drake had been indicted for leaking information that appeared to be in the public interest, and that he was indicted under something called the Espionage Act. And I said, to me, this sounds like whistleblowing, classic whistleblowing. And only 3 other people in history have been who indicted under the Espionage Act for non-spy activity. The first one, significantly, was Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower. And then there were 2 other cases in the next 40 years, and then Thomas Drake. I immediately wrote an op-ed for the LA Times saying there's a difference between leaking and whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is to expose government fraud, waste, abuse, illegality, and dangers to public health and safety. Leaking has no public interest value. For example, when Rich Armitage and Scooter Libby leaked Valerie Plame's name just to punish her husband for writing an op-ed that there was no yellow cake uranium in Niger. That had no public purpose, that leak. The biggest leaker, in fact, who's the biggest leaker in this country? The government, the US government, is the biggest leaker in this country. And with Tom's case, and I'll let Tom tell you about that, which we eventually won. I mean, there were 10 felony counts against him, when really what was so stunning to me was that, no one has a perfect, clean history, but Tom Drake was the most vanilla guy, and he had gone through every conceivable channel. That's a compliment, not... Well, there's actually a really funny thing from The Daily Show that we'll try to find later when we speak with Trevor Tim or show some other time about a license to leak, about how spy-like Tom is. You can tell he's a bad guy. But he had gone through, what was so amazing, like whistleblowers often will go to one channel or the wrong channel, or they'll try to get their message out, and then they don't come to us until they're being retaliated against. But he had gone to his boss. He had gone to the NSA Inspector General. He had gone to the Department of Defense Inspector General. And he had gone to both the intelligence committees of Congress on both the House and Senate side, talking about the wrongdoing that was occurring at NSA. And what was that? It was programs that were the embryonic stage of a lot of what Snowden is revealing now. So I was hoping Tom's case was a weird one-off, and that the fact that the case collapsed in such spectacular fashion, because it turned out Tom had no classified information. The government had only seized information from his house and stamped it classified after the fact. That's why we have a provision in the Constitution about no ex post facto laws, because you don't want to get a ticket for driving 25 miles an hour in a 25 mile an hour zone, and then when they suddenly change the speed limit to 15, and then ticket you for driving the proper speed limit the day before. It's simple. It's not fair. I was really hoping that Tom's case was a strange, weird experiment by the government. But unfortunately, it was the first in what we're now up to 8, I believe, Espionage Act prosecutions of whistleblowers, of individuals for non-spy activity. So we have Tom Drake, and then I worked on John Kiriaku's case. He was a whistleblower. He was the first CIA agent to confirm that torture was part of a program and not a few low-hanging bad fruit who were doing it. He confirmed that the US was waterboarding people. He went public with that. And right now he is serving 2.5 years in jail away from his 5 kids and wife. If John Kiriakou had actually tortured someone, he would not be in jail today, because he would be a beneficiary of the president's look forward, not backwards policy for all CIA agents who had actually engaged in the detention, rendition, and interrogation program. I ended up also representing other whistleblowers from NSA with whom Tom had blown the whistle, William Binney and Kirk Wiebe and Ed Loomis. And then these indictments kept piling up. And then Bradley Manning's case happened, and I think the administration completely became unhinged. Obama is obviously driven to distraction by leaks. And just when I'm sure they were really just cracking down, Edward Snowden happened. And Edward Snowden's case, Edward Snowden in the 2 videos by Laura Poitras said, I saw what happened to Tom Drake. So every time you read articles like Dianne Feinstein's yesterday, or Mike Rogers the week before, or General Hayden's lecture 2 weeks ago, every time you hear, he could have gone through proper channels No, he couldn't have, because guess what? He would have ended up being charged with espionage anyway. Not only did going through proper channels not get Tom Drake any kind of meaningful redress, it got him turned into the culprit when he had done nothing wrong but try to expose NSA illegalities. So Snowden did the only thing he could, really, on a disclosure this amazingly large, and he blew the whistle. I'm sure a lot of people have questions about that, and we can talk later, because there's a lot of disinformation and propaganda regularly coming out of the government about him being a spy, about him, why did he flee to Russia, and about endangering America. But again, know what? Those things were said about Tom Drake. By virtue of charging someone under the Espionage Act, you are labeling them an enemy of the state. In fact, the prosecutor in Tom Drake's case said that he would have the blood of soldiers on his hands when NSA goes dark. It's the same fear-mongering you're hearing today about Edward Snowden. The one person who I think might allow us to rein in our democracy from becoming a complete surveillance state. I hope that we can do that. In the meanwhile, it's very difficult and isolating. I thought that with John going to jail, that was the worst thing that could happen, until I realized Edward Snowden was rendered stateless and had to get political asylum. That's the price you have to pay for trying to tell the truth and trying to go through proper channels. That's not to discourage people from whistleblowing. I want people to whistleblow, but I want you to do it safely. So if you want to blow the whistle, consult a lawyer first, and we can help you do that in a safe way. Usually, I would say 95% of the people come to us after they've blown the whistle and the government's retaliating against them. So I would urge anyone who's thinking of doing that to consult a lawyer. And I will turn you over to the amazing Tom Drake, who's been a wonderful friend, client, and kindred spirit on this crazy journey that we're on right now, talking to whoever wants to hear from us in the hopes of salvaging our democracy. So thank you for hearing us today and for inviting us.
Extraordinary honor to be here today. I want to start off with a couple of light moments, given that we are in the...
Tom, you're a little bit hard to hear. He's working on it.
Do you want my mic?
Get the mic closer to your mouth.
How's that? Is that better?
I can just give you my mic.
How's that? Hear me now?
Okay.
So you create lights with this?
Yeah.
What about now? Wow. We have audio. I want to start off with a couple light moments, given that we're in the great state of New Hampshire. There is a state west of you called Vermont. I'll refer to Vermont and New Hampshire as sibling rivals. You can't tell them apart, according to most people, except one of them is upside down. As we know, the motto of New Hampshire is live free or die. In Vermont, it's live free and die. You have a flag that says don't tread on me. Well, you know, Vermont does have its own dagger of dissent, exemplified by the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen. The rock, I believe, in New Hampshire, the state rock is granite, although the old man in the mountain his face did fall off. Not sure how hard that was. We have marble in Vermont. You know, it's soft. Vermont's landlocked. New Hampshire has beaches. Vermont does have the oldest constitution of the states. New Hampshire is second, adopting its constitution in 1784, 7 years after Vermont's. Vermont does yield the sweet ambrosia of maple syrup. New Hampshire yields us the Old Farmer's Almanac and pewter. Speaking of maple syrup, do you see the latest revelations that we knew this when I was a kid growing up on a farm in Vermont? That apparently maple syrup, there's a recent sap discovery regarding maple, that we've had it wrong all along. Sap does rise, at least within the trees in Vermont, but apparently when you're upside down, it makes it a lot easier to tap them. So right side up, left side down, twin states separated by the Connecticut River. New Hampshire and Vermont are simply America's quotation marks. My confession is I did grow up in Vermont. I consider Vermont my home state. I grew up in the First Republic, as it's known, after moving from an even older former republic called the great state of Texas. While I lived in Vermont, I went to a one-room schoolhouse. I was the only kid in third grade. Half the school was one family. But there's one thing about Vermont that was extraordinary, just to set the scene, was a Vermont town meeting day. It was the one time during the year when anybody in town could say their piece. Anybody. You didn't have to disagree with them. You could agree with them, but you were there to listen. The voice of the community was heard at town meeting day. And I remember in Wells, Vermont, where I spent most of my youth in Vermont, I still remember Fred Cooper was the voice of the community. He was the conscience of the community. Fred spent most of his time driving around the highways and byways and the dirt roads of Wells. No one ever quite figured out how he managed to run a dairy farm or even keep his cows in order, because half the time they're out in other people's fields. But any time Fred spoke at the Vermont town meeting in March during mud season, people listened, because he would tell you what wasn't right. He would grudgingly acknowledge the things that were right. And if you didn't listen to Fred, you could say he was really the community's local crier / whistleblower. You did so at your own peril. I'm reminded of that because it's extraordinarily poignant for me to stand here before you as a free man. Do you know what it means? Do you know what it means to keep your freedom when the government did everything they could to take that freedom away from me? Do you know what it means to actually keep those freedoms? They mean more to me now than ever, because I was able to keep my freedoms. I did not end up in jail. I did not end up paying a fine. I remained free after an extraordinary 5-year ordeal. We must restore our constitutional republic, one person at a time, one community at a time, and one state at a time. See, the times we live in right now are eerily similar to the pre-revolutionary period in our history. before we actually separate ourselves from the crown. New Hampshire, acknowledging New Hampshire, was the first to declare its independence. And yet, in today's world, in the 21st century America, it is a dangerous act of criminality to speak truth to or of power. The Obama administration is being engaged now in an unprecedented war on whistleblowers and truth tellers. More Americans have been charged under the World War I era statute, called the Espionage Act, than all other administrations combined. It is a direct assault on the First Amendment, the cornerstone amendment of the Bill of Rights. You take out the cornerstone, the House collapses. And yet the government regards information as a coin of the realm and wants to control it, wants to control the message, wants to hold it. Information is power. It's important for you to understand that the two of us up here before you, we are the canaries in the constitutional coal mine. We do not want the rest of this country, let alone a citizen in New Hampshire, to live what we've lived at the hands of the national security and surveillance state. It is not, I repeat, not a pretty picture. We are the ones who have watched and continue to watch the watchers, but we didn't just watch. We stood on the top of the equivalent of Mount Washington, of the national security state, and blew the whistle. Imagine standing on the top of Mount Washington. And if you say something, is anybody there to hear it? As I recall, the highest recorded wind speed on this globe was actually measured on the top of Mount Washington some decades ago. Triple the speed of the average hurricane. At the time, no one else really heard us, truth be told, except the government, and they were listening. 9/11 was my first day on the job. It's a day that I will always remember. I was hired in under a special program by General Hayden. And yet, when 9/11, the tragedy, the murders, the 3,000, both in New York, at the Pentagon, the government had utterly failed its fundamental responsibilities under the Constitution. We often forget this. Even Americans had utterly failed. Go back to the preamble. Two fundamental responsibilities of government: provide for the general defense and the common welfare. Utterly failed on the first. Systemic failure. And NSA was fundamentally culpable. Did not keep people out of harm's way. And look what it unleashed. What I was eyewitness to in those literally days and weeks after 9/11 was the government unchaining itself from the Constitution. An anathema form of government. Not only had the wheels come off, I recognized to my horror that we were in an entirely different vehicle, and I did not recognize that vehicle, and I vowed then, and I continued to vow in the intervening years until I could no longer remain within the system, because I had taken an oath to what? An idea, and how to govern ourselves. Supporting and defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And to my horror, I realized that the enemy was now my own government. The government had abandoned what I had spent a lifetime defending. Subverting the very Constitution that I had taken an oath 4 times in my career, once in the military, in the Air Force, I would say twice in the military, Air Force during the Cold War, flying in RC-135s, in which I became an expert in East Germany and the Warsaw Pact as a German-Russian linguist. CIA, where I was an imagery analyst, at the Navy, serving in the Pentagon, in the Alert Center, National Military Joint Intelligence Center, and then as a senior executive at the National Security Agency. I was eyewitness to the subversion of our own Constitution. And I will tell you now, and I will keep saying it, and I've said it over the last several years, it was never necessary. It never had to happen. Never. I am burdened by dark history and dark knowledge of what could have been. I knew that if I remained silent, that I would be complicit in a crime. I knew that if I remained silent, I would be an accessory to a crime. We're talking about crimes as defined in the Constitution, high crimes and misdemeanors. 3 categories. I'll just summarize them. Secret surveillance on a scale that has still not been fully revealed to this day. Go back and listen to my March 15th, 2013 Sunshine Week speech at the National Press Club. An extraordinary surveillance apparatus completely violating the Fourth Amendment, totally violating the exclusive means by which NSA could conduct electronic surveillance on U.S. persons, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, turning the United States into the equivalent of a foreign nation for blanket dragnet electronic surveillance. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, the government regarded all of us as foreigners. Massive fraud, waste, and abuse. I cannot begin to tell you the sheer amount of money, the billions and billions and billions of dollars that were pumped into. It's now hundreds and hundreds of billions. It's actually in the low trillions now, the amount of money since 9/11 that's been spent on quote-unquote security. And the thing that haunts me to this day is I blew the whistle on the intelligence failures that lie at the heart of 9/11. That NSA had critical information that was never shared. And if it had been shared, there is no doubt in my mind that it would have stopped 9/11 all by itself. In 2006, after exhausting every channel that existed, as described by Jesslyn, I ended up going to the press, exercising my First Amendment rights. And what I knew, anybody ever been visited by the FBI? It's not a pleasant experience. I was getting ready for work on November 28, 2007, where I was then teaching after gone through extraordinary retaliation and reprisal at the hands of the government within the system, essentially being left bereft with no job and no a made-up title. I was teaching as a professor of behavioral science, leadership, strategic leadership, information strategies, and leadership ethics. They showed up at my house with a warrant. They showed up at my office at the university, and they also had a warrant for my car. There was yet another warrant, it turns out, for my internet service provider. That's when the nightmare began. A dozen FBI agents, armed, streaming across the front yard. They tossed my house. They took my personal effects. They managed to convince a magistrate judge that I was a national security threat. In fact, apparently I was such a national security threat because I was causing and had caused exceptionally grave damage to the United States of America. Their central thesis was focused on what I knew about the secret surveillance programs. So where are the sons and daughters of liberty today? Who are the sons and daughters of liberty today? Because see, that FBI raid began, although I've been under extraordinary surveillance, both electronic and physical, in the intervening 18 months. It had only just begun the nightmare. Because 2.5 years later, to make a long story short, there's a lot that went on in between. Under the Obama administration, I was charged on the Espionage Act, the first whistleblower since Dan Ellsberg. The first, under Obama, charged with espionage. A government bound to protect liberty is now unbounded with the self-authorizing license to subvert our liberty in the name of national security. National security has become the state religion. The Constitution is a threat. It's in the way of national security. Must think about this, and I'm going to use really strong language. Because in the intervening years, and with a remarkable woman to the right of me, I was able to keep my freedoms. She was my voice when I had none. She was my defender in the court of public opinion. They had confiscated my passport. I could not travel outside the United States. Any travel outside the local area required special permission from the court, and the government had right of first refusal. The only thing they did not do was put a bracelet on me. My life was completely turned upside down. Their design on me was to destroy me. Remember why they came after me. If I'm the government and I have the secret ability to collect and analyze data with few, if any, constraints, all this stuff we've seen since the Patriot Act, the FISA Amendments Act, any number of other Enabling Act legislation, Enabling Act. Go back and look at Article 48 during a certain period in German history. Redefining law to give the appearance, the kabuki dance appearance of legality. Conveniently forgetting about the Constitution as the law of the land. I grew up in the 1970s as a very young adult. I remember the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and a president resigning his office. I remember the articles of impeachment, abusing instruments of national power against their own citizens. History doesn't forget, and history's not kind. But if you have the secret ability to collect and analyze data, especially on people, I will tell you it is seductively powerful. And when done without your permission, when done without your knowledge, when done in secret, it is the ultimate form of control over others. Because that's what all this is about. Very, very little of it has anything to do with the existential threat of terrorism. And when you have this magnitude of surveillance, hiding behind the veil of secrecy, while it professes openness and transparency, remember the Obama administration trademark alert will become the most open and transparent administration in U.S. history. While practicing opaqueness and deceit, that's when citizens need to become extremely aware and wary of what that future might hold, because their very liberties are being eroded out from under them, taken away in the name of national security without our consent. And all this fear-mongering, invocation of threats, real and imagined. What kind of climate does that create? Because the government wants to control both the public and the private agenda. Because my criminal case is direct evidence of an out-of-control system. It is literally an off-the-books government. I keep saying this. People don't want to believe it. I said earlier in my talk, the government unchained itself from the Constitution. It's been operating under emergency conditions ever since. That's the truth. I knew that right after 9/11. Remember the oath I took. It's only an oath to an idea and how to govern ourselves. It was a grand experiment launch over 220 years ago. But a woman reporter purportedly asked Benjamin Franklin at the conclusion of that Constitutional Convention, that long, hot summer in Philadelphia in 1787, what did you guys create in there? And he reportedly said, a republic if you can keep it. There were no guarantees. None. This rise in a contrarian, alien form of government cannot, I repeat, cannot coexist with constitutional government. Something has to give. And this shape of a national security state evidence the all too familiar and the historical characteristics, and all too familiar, all too distinct form of an alarming soft tyranny. It is anathema to all forms of constitutional republics and democracies. Anybody read Montesquieu? No tyranny is more cruel than that which is practiced in the shadow of the law and with the trappings of justice. That is, one would drown the unfortunate by the very plank by which he would hope to be saved. What happens when you sacrifice the rights of the citizenry and our own individual sovereignty for mass surveillance, primacy of power, privilege, access, information control? The brutal crackdown by the Obama administration on whistleblowers and truth tellers is extraordinary. We've never seen in recorded history this kind of surveillance state. And I recognize that NSA did not originate the surveillance state, because I used to fly against one, several. But they're doing this and have been doing this, NSA, until my own disclosures and others, but in particular since the Snowden disclosures. Been doing this on an extraordinarily vast scale in secret. The heart of the democratic and constitutional paradigm is turned inside out and upside down. Secret dossiers held by the state. We've never had, because of technology, the ability to persistently collect what I will call the panopticon of power, constant gaze, always having even more access to even more information about people, just in case. Look, the Stasi, the state of East Germany, we're not East Germany yet, but we certainly have all the trappings of that surveillance apparatus. They were monstrously efficient in keeping files in just about everybody. Their indexing scheme, some recent reporting, which I was very familiar with back then, they had what they called metadata. It wasn't called, they didn't use that term, although I prefer to use meta content, but that was the metadata that allows them access to what else is available in terms of content on people. What does that say about who we are? What happens when someone like myself is criminalized for exercising my First Amendment rights because I'm exposing government wrongdoing and illegality? I remind you of what U.S. Senator Frank Church said during the 1970s. Extraordinary set of hearings, although I'd argue the Pike Committee hearings were even more extraordinary. But even in terms of Frank Church's hearings, he said, quote, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there'd be no way to fight back, because the most careful effort to combine together resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within reach of the government to know. Such is the capacity of technology. You know, Benjamin Franklin had a very interesting quote. He was always known for his aphorisms. Know what he said about democracy? 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for a meal. And liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. So, the Constitution, if you haven't heard, expired on 9/11. We are reaping the whirlwind of everything since. But I hear something, and I just want to share this before we transition to the Q&A period. I keep hearing this. Tom, I have nothing to hide. I have nothing to hide. Do you realize in saying that statement, you've already given up your privacy? You don't care about your privacy. You don't wish to defend your privacy. The very essence of who you are as a human being, a sovereign human being under natural law. You know who actually said you have nothing to worry about if you have nothing to hide? The chief propagandist during the Nazi era. Joseph Goebbels. So, I just want to conduct a mini privacy exercise with you all. So indulge me for a minute, because every time I run this exercise, no one has said yes yet, except one cute person who said maybe in California. So if you say you have nothing to hide, because I keep hearing this, continue to hear this, then why don't you just give me the keys to your car right now? Why don't you give me the keys to your apartment or your house? All the passwords of every account you have. Just hand over all your medical records. Just give them to me. You say you have nothing to hide. All your computers. Everything there is to know about you. Just give it to me. Would you?
No.
Why?
Because it's my information.
It's your information, but you have nothing to hide. If you have nothing to hide, you should be more than willing, by consent, to give me your information. Don't you trust me as a fellow American citizen? I'm one of you. I'm not one of them. I'm not some foreign agent. Why not?
Because it's mine.
It's mine. Really? You own something? Really? You know, it's funny because if you're not willing, if people are not willing to give up what is theirs by consent, why do so without your consent?
Fear.
Fear. Wow, fear. You know, I did not take an oath to defend fear. I didn't. You know, I'm fortunate I didn't end up in an actual prison. I expressed who I am and was defended based on who I am as a sovereign individual with inalienable rights, amongst which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those extraordinary words in the Declaration of Independence, and a form of government after the abysmal failure of the Articles of Confederation that launched the United States of America. The last thing we need is some kind of fence around us. What Adams and the Sons of Liberty did in Boston was spread the word about the abuses of the British. They had committees of correspondence. Look up the history. It's really extraordinary. It's so eerily familiar to me. It's like we're going back to a future that already happened. We need committees of correspondence now. That's taking action. Because what's happening is this whole landscape of who we are and sovereignty is being transformed. I said the U.S. government unchained itself from the Constitution. Guess what replaced it? Article 2 powers that are apparently inherent in that role called Commander-in-Chief of the President. Do you know what that does to the rest of the landscape? It militarizes it. I used to be in the military. I'm very familiar with that system. But what happens when you militarize everything? Under the so-called Article 2 justification, which, by the way, is a complete subversion of what that actual role is. It's become now a political crime. Think about history to expose government crimes against society. Freedom's ring must not dim. Knowing all this, exposing wrongdoing, illegality is not sufficient. See, I could argue as a student of politics and history that if you do away with just, never mind the second, the third, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, the ninth, the 10th, the 14th, and a couple of others, but in particular, based on the pre-revolutionary period, if you do away or substantially erode the First and Fourth Amendment, I will argue you do not have an America. You do not. And that's what's disappearing. Do we really want the government listening in and tracking the lives of so many others? Is intolerance shown by the secret federal government for the magnificence of our precious First Amendment? Freedom's a foreboding of things to come. Will national security replace individual rights, where citizens with rights simply become subjects with privileges dispensed by the state? I will resist with every fiber of my being. Will fear take priority over freedom? Will government censorship and propaganda triumph over personal choice and disclosure? Is suppression and repression, as we've experienced at any number of others, and some you have never even heard about, become the instrument for stamping out dissent and those who dare question what this Q represents, especially authority? Is the tree of liberty becoming an endangered species? Better start planting some trees. Remember Johnny Appleseed? Who defends our rights in the face of secret government power? You know, none of this is necessary. I still wake up with chills at night because I knew that the very best of American ingenuity and innovation had solved this problem. We never had to go to the dark side. It was never necessary. Could have prosecuted, got after the bad guys, done so completely within bounds. But it was all rejected. So change is needed, but it cannot be faux change. It cannot be fake change. It cannot be just changing the ruffles on the surveillance drapes to merely a different color. If you look it up, myself and other colleagues, we sent a memo, an open memo to the president. We also listed 22 recommendations on what to do that was necessary to roll back the national security state. And so I'll end with this. I fully appreciate and acknowledge that Americans give the government wide berth. Bismarck was right. It's like governance, like making sausage. Most people don't like to watch sausage being made. The majority of Americans accept the need to safeguard who we are, bring to light legitimate crimes against Americans and others. But there's this pernicious ends justifies the means, that somehow it's a zero-sum game, the false dichotomy, that to have security we have to erode liberty, when in fact the foundations of national security rest directly on our liberties and our freedoms and our rights as sovereign human beings. Our credibility as a nation has been severely undermined, not only in the United States but overseas. I had this extraordinarily chilling conversation with a couple from Germany recently. He said, Tom, at least we know we live in a post-fascist society. You all live in a pre-fascist society and don't even know it. Fascism, oh my gosh, you use the word fascism and people really cringe. So what do? I've given you some hints. We have to restore the constitutional republic. Period. That's the first thing. We need to ensure that if we starve liberty for the sake of security, if we forsake liberty for the sake of security, what will we have left to defend? It is our freedom of choice that's at stake as citizens. It is not the government's to take them away. We must now rescue the Constitution from our own government. Our rights and our precious liberties are the very living blueprint and beacon for our personal freedoms. And so I do hear a new cry for liberty across the land. It is time for a new revolution, a revolution that restores the sovereignty of the people. This conference itself provides the very tools, the very connections, the very community you need to restore what is rightfully our inheritance as sovereign citizens. We must, I repeat, must elect into office a whole new generation of leaders, locally, regionally, and nationally. We must continue to expose and disclose the usurpations of power against the people, establishing community-wide action committees, safeguarding not just personal, but also our community-based economic freedom. Remember, those who are best governed are least governed, but that's the weak spot in the constitutional republic. I don't want to see the grand experiment. I really don't. Disappear in the dustbins of history. The question we must answer for ourselves and our posterity is fundamental. What future do we want to keep? After all, we are the people. We are the people. Those extraordinary words, the preamble of the Constitution, that we are the people in order to form a more perfect union, standing here together, defending and protecting the very best of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on the front lines of freedom, as citizens with inalienable rights and not subjects of the state. Thank you. Use that.
Wow, that was pretty emotional for me. Can you hear me? No. That was emotional, wasn't it? Yeah. Wasn't it amazing? Thank you so much for what you did. Paul, I don't know how to make. Oh, all right. Here you go, Daryl.
I actually have a question for each one of you individually. Mr. Drake, knowing that there are more laws on the books than could be read in, I've heard, 4 lifetimes, would you agree that the only crime is disobeying the state?
That's certainly what it's come to. Yeah, you disobey the state, but they're the ones defining how you disobey or whether or not you disobey. I mean, one of the things, there's an arbitrariness here beyond what is established as the supreme law of the land, with due process and all of the procedures that protect your innocence until proven beyond all doubt that you're guilty, and that's done in a court of law. That's an Article 3 court, not any other court. If you don't have that, then it's fiat law, and that's not real law. That's executive rule.
And Ms. Radack, could you go into as much detail as you were allowed about the incident that you had in Heathrow Airport a few days ago, where you were questioned in detail about your connection to Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and Private Manning?
Yeah, I was going to London to present the Sam Adams Award for Integrity and Intelligence to a representative of Bradley Manning. And in going through customs, which of course is militarized and called the border force in England, they asked the usual questions like, why are you here? I said, to see friends. They're like, who? I said, the Sam Adams Associates. Who are those people? I named some public figures that, that are in the group, like Tom and Ray McGovern, Colleen Rowley, Annie Michon. But then they asked why I had gone to Russia twice in the last 3 months. And I just said that I have a client there. And they said, who? And I said, Edward Snowden. It gets better. And then they said, who is Edward Snowden? Obviously, I couldn't give a flip answer, like, have you been asleep for the last 8 months? Not read a newspaper? He's like one of the most well-known people on the planet right now. But I couldn't do that. I knew in my mind I had to calculate what kind of answer can I give that will be satisfactory, because this question is completely out of line. I could have just said a human being, a person. So I just said a whistleblower and an asylee, because that was a legal definition that fit. And then he wanted to know, who is Bradley Manning? I said, he's a whistleblower. And then he said, where is Bradley Manning? As if he didn't know. I said, in jail. And he said, well, then he's a criminal. And I said, he's a political prisoner. And then he said, but you represent Snowden. And I said, I am a human rights attorney. And it ended there, but it was very intimidating. I was definitely very rattled by it, because these matters of clients, who I represent, and what meetings I've gone to with different clients, that delves into the attorney-client privilege. Tom has authorized me to be public that I represent him. It is public that I am a legal advisor, one of Snowden's legal advisors. But being put in that kind of position of who you represent, who are, and being asked about clients is beyond the pale. And it was done for no other reason than to intimidate and rattle me and unnerve me, which it did. But I guess they didn't realize I'd already been on a no-fly list. So if they put me on some inhibited person list, I'm one of the least inhibited people, I think, at least on the East Coast. But I didn't realize that flying was now a hazard, a job hazard, but it is.
I could be mistaken on this, but it seems to me that part of the reason that the government does have so much control over us and can do all the evil things it's been doing is because it can take money from us. Do you have any advice as to what we can do to hold on to our own money, and it will at least stop some of the things that you even admitted they spend a lot of money on, and they're getting it from us?
I think the most effective thing, one of the most effective things you can do, first of all, I mean, I can't advise anyone to be a pro se tax protester, or I can't, you do that. But like, for example, when I got my bill for bar dues while I was still under investigation for the 9th and 10th year, I would pay it and write in protest, when I paid it. My signature line on my email, and I urge all of you under your signatures just to make it an automatic, this email is being monitored without consent in secret by the National Security Agency. This email is being collected and stored by the National Security Agency without my consent or that of the other party, because it makes people actually think. It makes people actually realize that this is tangible. No matter how innocuous your email is, it's being kept and stored. So your email with a little inside joke or something, or if you look at my Google search, it's like Al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula, crockpot bombs, fertilizer bombs. Why do men have nipples? I look like a perverted terrorist. But really, in context, I'm a mom of 2 teenage boys, and I'm a lawyer doing my job, and terrorism and national security happens to be a focus of that, torture in particular. I think it is incredibly important. It does matter. I live in DC. I don't have a voting representative in Congress, but you guys do. And every single time you actually call or email, they make a mark. So, and I know it's not perfect, but call them. It's easy to do through the internet and say, I support the USA Freedom Act. I don't support Dianne Feinstein's bullshit law. The other thing to do, which was when Justin Amash had a bill to defund the entire NSA, any spying programs that spied on Americans, that almost passed. It failed by 12 votes. And I bet if people in America had been more vocal that this must pass, it would have passed. Even people who voted against it, like Sensenbrenner, who wrote the Patriot Act, for God's sake, even he said that if he knew all the information that has been revealed now because of Snowden, he would have voted for that. I think the only way to really choke the national security state is to defund it. It is more than 1/6 of the US budget is being spent on fake secrecy, body scanners at airports, taking off your shoes, all this security theater that has become a part of our daily life and really does nothing. Did it prevent the Boston bombing? No. Is having a surveillance camera good for accident reconstruction? Sure. But even the government's, how many cameras in Boston? Hundreds of cameras in Boston were not enough. They had to do a crowdsourced manhunt to try to find the Tsarnaev brothers. And it turned into an interesting experiment in militarized police where people just went in, police and law enforcement went into people's houses without warrants to look. So as much as you hate Congress, and I hate Congress, they're horrible, but call them, bother them, email them, tell them, I don't want, when you pay your taxes, say, I don't want any of this to be spent on national security. Of course it will be, but doing stuff like that, like rebellion light, deuce rebellion, gentle rebellion, is actually very powerful. So that's something I would do, as well as in your daily life. How many of you are on Facebook? Probably a lot of you. There's WhatsApp now. There are other alternatives to Facebook. Even though you have privacy settings, you can set them, but as we know, the NSA backdoors it. But there are a lot of ways. Use encryption. Anyone who has patients or clients or that kind of stuff, use encryption, PGP, pretty good encryption, pretty good privacy, PGP. It's easy to use. There's an app on your phone for it. It's not that hard to do. Use encryption. Make it difficult for them. Because if you want a free internet, you need to keep the NSA and the government and the GCHQ away from it.
The other part of your question would take a much longer answer, and having studied this for some time, I mean, I'm a living example, as are colleagues, in which we are unable to actually find any real work because we are cast outside the system. The fact remains that even though I actually formed my own company some years ago, I was unable to find any work. I am still unable to find any work. Because it's clear that once a government has defined you as an enemy of the state, dissident, worthy of criminal sanctions, and even though I was able to remain free, the fact remains that I'm considered radioactive. And you do have the reality that the means of production are increasingly owned by the 1%. And so I've been calling in different fora and other environments, we need to take back our own means of production. We have to make ourselves much more independent because this is what's happening. So you're combining ownership of large-scale means of production, which is an interesting form of a state. Okay, you bring government and corporations together. Look at history, right? I said the word before. You combine that with government and corporations having extraordinary means to gather information about you, right? One of the great elephants in the room with the security state is that they're engaged in very significant economic and industrial espionage. And obviously that's done for the benefit of the state and the corporations that partner with them. This is the nature of this kind of a system. History's not kind, but they're not going to yield power willingly. And in America, there is a thing called the free enterprise system. I'm going to make a very clear distinction here. That is not capitalism. It's not. The free enterprise system is really the very best of what America has always been. I mean, this is something I was extremely present to even at NSA, that the very best of America had actually solved the challenge problems at NSA, including how do you make sense of large amounts of data. Well, we did it for a little over $3 million. I was the executive program manager. And yet, here was the reality. The general of NSA had said, you know what? We're not going to make it. I don't care if there's an existing solution. I'm going to go out to the military industrial complex and buy it. And when you go out there, you're going to spend a lot of money. And it's a whole different system because they're there to maximize profit on an extraordinary scale. They're not there to actually serve in the best interests of the American public. They're serving private interests, not public interest. So we have to take back those means of production, and that really starts with us locally. That starts in the communities. And I'm quite encouraged as I've gone across the United States, seeing many, many local initiatives. Many of them you only hear about locally, or maybe on a small scale regionally, because that's really where it happens. And that takes us back, and combining that with the best of technology, that takes us back to an era that I think is much more fitting as to who we are as people without having to serve other masters. And the irony for me, of course, the Constitution itself, it was the elites, it was the dissident elites of the day, who had property, who had access. They were in a conspiracy against the crown. They were the terrorists of the day. And they knew in order to preserve their own rights, and I'm the first to acknowledge, Constitution, had a lot of contradictions built into it. They had to extend the rights to everybody, right? And it's one of the kind of the paradoxes of even the Bill of Rights. Because remember, the Constitution was passed over a 2-year period, but then there's this hue and cry about, wait a minute, you haven't enumerated the rights of the people. So you have to put together those first 10 and go back out, okay, to the original 13, and then Vermont, the 14th state, then it threw in as well. So here is us. This is the other part of sovereignty. It's not just that these rights, remember the original life, liberty, and property was actually the word that was going to be used in the Declaration of Independence. But to me, that was too limiting. That pursuit of happiness really was a much more overarching term because it includes your ability to pursue your own livelihood freely.
From a practical standpoint, I'm involved in a lot of litigation with banks. I got a target on my back. They grabbed me and my wife a couple years ago, so been there a different way. Won't go there. Can you talk to everybody here, because I attacked jurisdiction a couple of years ago. After they grabbed me, I smartened up. Subpoena came from a state agency. I attacked jurisdiction, and we've been pretty successful with a jurisdictional challenge. You gave some, I heard some of the words you guys were using about sovereignty, man, person. For all of us going back home every day, how effective, you guys are on this high level, how effective is attacking jurisdiction for day to day? Attacking it jurisdictionally as opposed to I do not consent, I do not recall. Is a jurisdictional challenge a viable way, even though they got the guns because they've grabbed me, but we've had some wins with jurisdictional challenges. So could you talk to that? Thanks.
I think, yeah, definitely you can have some wins that way, but unfortunately the government is using jurisdictional challenge to justify a lot of their most illegal conduct, that the FISA court somehow has jurisdiction to issue a broad order that Verizon can collect all customer data. Even if like you're on the ACLU website, they have a very basic, like your rights under the Bill of Rights. I think when an agent does come to you, most people's impulse is to cooperate. Most of my clients have, because we're law-abiding Americans and we want to help the FBI. Don't. You're under no obligation to. Don't cooperate. If you're in a room, you ask if you're free to leave. And if you are, leave. Always ask for an attorney. Don't cooperate. It is never in your interest. There are other ways, just on your personal jurisdiction, jurisdiction not necessarily delimited by where you live, though certainly those kinds of jurisdictional arguments can be raised, but delimited by the Constitution. They can't search or seize your property without a warrant. And you don't have to incriminate yourself or your friends or anybody. You don't even have to talk to a government agent. In fact, you shouldn't. Oh, it's just a few questions. Oh, we're just, no worries, just a couple questions. No, you can say no. I think people don't realize that they can say no. I think the surveillance state, the police state, has become so normalized and so inured to our daily lives that people are acting very subservient to the government, and they really don't have to. And when people rebel, it works. 2 days ago, DHS rolled out its plan to get the DMV information on everyone. There was a huge popular outcry on Twitter, by the way, at Thomas_Drake1, at Jesselyn Radack. Feel free to follow us because we put up a lot of stuff about here's an action you can take today to thwart what the government's trying to do. And because there was such a popular outcry, DHS the next day was like, okay, we're dropping the license plate program. Now, will they really do that? I don't know, but at least they heard the pushback. At least people are pushing back rather than blindly acquiescing as they have been over the last decade and more since 9/11. So jurisdiction is definitely an argument that can be raised, but there are ones that are even more fundamental than that also people should be thinking about on a regular basis when the government tries to intrude.
Mr. Drake, I've heard a number of congressional members talk about how they're comfortable with the answers they receive from NSA officials, even liberty-minded members of Congress. Have General Hayden and other members of the NSA or other organizations committed perjury before Congress? And Ms. Radack, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the lawsuit that Senator Paul recently initiated and whether you think that will produce new information or some changes.
The answer to senior officials coming before Congress and perjuring themselves is yes. Last time I checked, at least back in the 1970s, if you did so, there were consequences. Apparently, there are no consequences to lying to Congress or providing them talking points that, at a minimum, are misrepresentations. At worst, they're actually pathological lies designed to cover up the truth. And this is what's happened in our country. It's one of the saddest things for me is seeing this is authoritarianism run amok. Well, it doesn't matter what the truth is. It's just what we can get away with. It's the catch-22 principle. I mean, you have this astonishing statement by Clapper, the director of national intelligence, when confronted, and he well knew the question that Wyden was asking of him. Later says, well, it was the least untruthful thing I could say. Least untruthful? I mean, you know, that initiated a whole host of, you know, late night comic reenactments, okay? I mean, this is what's happened. We have government officials who routinely lie. And yet, why they're lying, I know why they're lying, because they don't want to admit to the truth of how far they've gone in the name of national security. And it's certainly not in the public interest. And now you have Clapper saying, oh, we should have actually, this is his latest, we should have actually, yeah, it was a mistake. We should have actually at least told the American public about mass surveillance back then and made the case then. That way they would understand. Really? That is a complete mischaracterization, and I'm being polite, because I confronted them within the system when I was blowing the whistle. And they said, if we go to Congress with what we want to do, they'll say no. And I said, really? You know, there is a constitutional means by which you change the law. If you're saying the existing law, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, is insufficient to pursue the threat, go to Congress, make your case. And yet they're telling me no. So what they decided to do, just break the law, figuring they get away with it. If you listen to General Hayden, it wasn't too long ago that included Bart Gellman. He's one of the reporters on contract with the Washington Post. He was confronted by an audience member during Q&A about why you weren't yourself charged with criminality for having violated the Constitution. And if you listen carefully to Hayden's words, it's extraordinary dissembling of an authoritarian about the Constitution. He actually avoids talking about the Fourth Amendment. What he says, it was legal under Article 2 powers, inherent powers already given, gave me the authority. Really? If that's so true, then why did we have all this Enabling Act legislation? Why was that necessary? Why did it become necessary to have ex post facto laws, which are a violation of the Constitution, as Jess was saying earlier? If, in fact, it was all legal, except he said in the same thing, it's all legal. All three branches, even a recent speech before the Oxford Union in the debate chamber, all legal.
Okay, it's obvious that General Alexander and James Clapper and Michael Hayden have testified before Congress, and they won't be held accountable for it. No one's being prosecuted for perjury. In fact, NSA is not being investigated. There are 0 investigations into what NSA has done. Every single call collected is a felony that carries a $10,000 fine times 36 billion a day. I mean, it's just astronomical if you think about it, but no one will be held accountable for that. In terms of Rand Paul's lawsuit, I hope it gains traction in the courts. One of the gifts that Edward Snowden gave us that may be lost on the non-lawyers is that when everybody talks about checks and balances and courts approving this, that's absolute bullshit. All these lawsuits have been blocked. Any lawsuit involving torture or secret surveillance have been blocked by the government, asserting lack of standing to bring the lawsuit or it's a state secret. And Snowden has blown the lid off of both of those arguments. So now lawsuits by the Electronic Privacy Information Center, I think they filed the first one after Snowden's disclosure, by the ACLU, by Ron Paul, whose show I was just on recently, if you subscribe to that channel. All of that can go forward now. And 2 judges have already ruled. Judge Leon said, this doesn't work and is likely unconstitutional. Another judge ruled the other way, but the point is that third branch of government is finally working again thanks to Snowden. The second branch of government, Congress, had been a rubber stamp, but now they actually have to take on this stuff, and a number of them are up for re-election. And I look forward to the day Dianne Feinstein is voted out of office. So anyone who tries to say, oh, well, the 3 branches of government have been working, that's just a lie. The executive branch has been a unitary executive indeed since 9/11. So hopefully Rand Paul's lawsuit will gain traction, as have a number of the other lawsuits filed. I think only one got dismissed, but it was not a pure surveillance lawsuit.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there anyone? Okay, I've got two. Are you willing to take two? Oh, yeah. Okay, so let's do the two. And I would like to thank you both for staying a little bit longer. Where'd you go? There you are.
So on the issue with standing to proceed with the cases, have you considered something like a qui tam on the salary of the members who've testified before Congress and lied?
Yeah, I did qui tam actions for 2 years. You usually have to bring those against contractors because you are bringing the qui tam on behalf of the government, and the government is never going to intervene in a qui tam lawsuit against NSA, its own people. Like if you're like the government would join your side basically in a qui tam action against like Halliburton or Blackwater, and NSA has immunity. They have immunity in the Constitution. They have sovereign immunity. You are not going to be able to sue an agency, or its high-level officials will have either partial immunity or absolute immunity. When you go sue a high-level agency official like General Hayden or General Alexander, that gets dismissed, and under something called the Westfall Act, it ends up proceeding against the United States, which will raise sovereign immunity and dismiss your lawsuit like that, unfortunately.
So I'm curious how much you feel the well of the internet has been poisoned. You're obviously advocating going out on Twitter and Facebook and everything and advocating ourselves. This is something that in Soviet Russia you wouldn't do. The Samizdat movement was driven completely underground. And so we're not at that point yet, but I'm curious with how deep you feel the well of sharing online and between each other has been poisoned, and what measures we would need to take care of ourselves. Obviously, you are promoting your ideas, so.
I think the well has been poisoned to the extent that the government has backdoored all the major carriers in the U.S., Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, all 9 of them. But there are things you can do to protect yourself. Instead of using Gmail, you can go to @riseup.net. You can encrypt any communication that's actually has personal data or information you don't want known. I think the technologists are way ahead of the lawyers on this, and they're way ahead of Congress. And people who are creating Tor, like Jake Applebaum, and other encryption software and other ways to protect yourself, don't bear back on the internet. Protect yourself. And I think the internet, there are a lot of hacktivists doing very legal work, doing everything they can to protect internet freedom. And I have found common cause between journalists and whistleblowers and hacktivists. And I never really thought of those 3 communities as overlapping, but I think we all have the same goal. There is a war on information by the government. The government wants it all because information is the currency of power, and power is the coin of the realm. You control your information. So to the extent you're going to put it all out there, decide whether or not you want it all out there or not. Or if it is out there, it's never too late to, at least take it down, at least add that little line to your emails that I protest the fact that this email is being collected and stored by the NSA. Have that be an automatic tag on every single email you send or on your website. So I do think, I have confidence actually that, as Snowden has shown, technology has succeeded here in blowing the lid off the scandal. And if anything, I think it's strengthened technologists' devotion to do white hat hacking and create safe encryption devices. I don't know if Trevor Tim's in here, but Trevor Tim of the Freedom of the Press. What? Well, Secure Drop is a great way. Yes, the New Yorker has Secure Drop. My organization has Secure Drop, a way to blow the whistle without it being detected. WikiLeaks obviously has an even more robust form of that. But there are things like that so that your communications can be shielded. Instead of doing Google, you can do DuckDuckGo, and your searches will be protected. There are a number of ways, and there are people here at this conference who are a lot more tech savvy than I am, who can walk you through them. I think Trevor Tim has an entire speech on encryption and how to do that for everything from your daily searches to your emails to your texts with your kids. So I encourage you to go to his talk later on.
The only thing I'll say here is just to dovetail off of Jesselyn. We cannot continue to live in fear of our own government. That's the bottom line. But you need to know I'm a very fortunate person. This war on whistleblowers, this war on information, this direct assault on the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, any number of the other precious rights and liberties that we're supposed to enjoy in this country, that are supposed to be protected by the government, are under direct assault. It is a brutal campaign that is occurring. It's being promulgated, it's being supported, and it's been going on for many, many years against the citizens. It's gone far beyond far beyond what the government has said are the reasons why they do this. All you have to do is look at their actions. I'm going to come all the way back around again. We are the canaries in the coal mine. The government attempted to make living examples of the two of us as well as others. Now, Edward Snowden had to escape the United States because he knew if he remained under a NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, he could be indefinitely detained, pulled off the street as a direct threat to the national security state. That's what's happening in this country. But the last thing we need to do is fear our own government. Because if that means they win. I have too many people I know who simply close their eyes, shut their ears, okay, and keep their lips sealed. Because they just, I want to live a quiet life, and that's someone else's problem to deal with. Really. They've already acquiesced. They've already self-censored. They're not going to question because it might bring undue attention. How much is freedom worth? How much would you pay for your own freedom? What's the value you place on personal liberty? These are fundamental questions that you must address as a sovereign human being. Because if you're willing to give all that up, guess what? There's plenty of people out there. Okay? The human condition, it's not a pleasant history. They're more than willing to control you. And hey, it's a lot better if you're self-censoring yourself, a lot better if you're not speaking up. It's a lot better if you're just going about your quiet life. If anybody's read Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if all you're worried about is just shelter and food, some of us gave up just about everything in supporting defending the Constitution. I was criminalized for defending the Constitution. I almost ended up in prison. Was that close? It really was. Do you know what it means? I'm going to say it again because we're the living examples. And so it's important that the voice of these examples is made crystal clear throughout the land. We don't want communities get caught up in what we got caught up in. We don't want the nation to become under surveillance always. USA, USA. We don't. What kind of life is that? What kind of society is that? It erodes the foundational precepts upon who we are as human beings in relationship to each other. Because see, in this kind of environment, everything becomes suspicionful, not suspicionless. There are no assumptions that you're innocent. You're up to no good. I mean, I want you to, it's chilling, but it's important to note, I face a distinct prospect in April of 2008, and most people I know break. The chief prosecutor looked at me across the table in a windowless, secure, classified facility occupied by the FBI in the greater DC area and said, Mr. Drake, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison unless you cooperate with our investigation? We have more than enough evidence to put you away for a long, long time. This is in America, because I dared stand up to them. See, I stood up to the White House within the system and then outside the system. There was no way I was going to let them get away with violating the Constitution. But see, they said, hey, Tom, you don't understand. The White House has approved these programs. It's all legal. It's all legal. We're the executive agent, really. Public doesn't know about this, really. We're doing this for their own good, really. I knew then it was going to have enormous strategic consequences. I've been reliving the past 12 years as a result of the last 8 months worth of Snowden disclosures, and they haven't ended. There's a lot at stake here, not just for us as people, but for the entire country and even the world. When I go to Germany, you know that it's interesting speaking with people from Germany. I gave you the quote earlier. They're well aware of their own history. They are extraordinarily sensitive to government intrusion on their rights as citizens. Their history is really dark. But somehow we're exempt from that? I don't think so. We're not. There's nothing unique about America in being exempt from this. These types, it's only being exempt from a surveillance state or a national security regime. We're not. I'm going to say it again. Since 9/11, the United States government has been operating under other than constitutional powers. Think about it. That's what they're hiding. That's what they're protecting. It's continuity of government by other means. They know they're in violation of the Constitution. They just want to be able to get away with it. And anybody gets in the way, they want to run over. Fortunately, those of us who have paid extraordinarily high prices are not willing to sit on the sidelines and watch all this just go by and become part of history. We're standing up because this is for us and our future, but it has to start now. The line is drawn now, not some other later date, not who, if it's not you, if it's not now, when? It's now. We're deep into it. So I encourage everybody to take everything you've heard here, all the other panel discussions and sessions you're going to hear, because they're going to give you the tools, the knowledge. You'll be informed citizens to go out and take action necessary to protect, preserve, and defend the fundamental nature of who you are as a sovereign human being.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Mr. Drake and Ms. Radack, I would just like to say personally, thank you for standing up for us. And if you'd like to speak with them, I'm sure they'll be around, but it's time for everyone to go off to lunch. So go fill your bellies. And thank you so much.
Thank you.